Iran is unstoppable now. This morning, Iran did not fire a single missile. It did something far more dangerous. It rewrote the rules of the world's most critical waterway, and China had already signed the agreement before Washington even read the first line. No explosion, no wreckage, no distress signal. What happened at the Strait of Hormuz in the past 60 minutes is quieter than all of that, and it will outlast all of that because what Iran announced this morning is not a military event that can be reversed by a counterstrike. It is a legal, economic, and strategic declaration that shifts the architecture of global power in ways that American aircraft carriers and American sanctions and American diplomatic pressure have no mechanism to undo. Iran has declared a new maritime governance framework for the Strait of Hormuz. Under this framework, all commercial vessels transiting the strait are required to register their passage with Iranian Maritime Authority, submit cargo declarations to Iranian Port Administration in Bandar Abbas, and operate under navigation protocols issued jointly by the Iranian Navy and a newly established Hormuz Transit Coordination Office, whose founding operational partner, announced simultaneously by Beijing and Tehran this morning, is the China Ocean Shipping Company, the largest shipping conglomerate on the planet. China did not object. China did not hesitate. China had already prepared its vessels for compliance because China knew this was coming. China helped design it. At 7:14 in the morning local time Thursday, Iranian state media broadcast a joint statement from the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. The statement used careful, measured, bureaucratic language. It described a framework for cooperative maritime governance. It referenced international shipping law. It cited the sovereign rights of coastal states under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It was written by people who understood that the most permanent revolutions are the ones that arrive dressed in paperwork. Washington's response arrived 41 minutes later. It described the announcement as provocative and contrary to international norms of freedom of navigation. It promised that the United States would work with its partners and allies to ensure unimpeded access to international waterways. It was the statement of a government that had just discovered that the game it thought it was winning had been replaced by a different game entirely, one with different rules, different players, and a different definition of leverage. In this breakdown, we are going to explain exactly how this moment was built, brick by brick, over a decade of strategic patience that Washington dismissed as economic desperation and Beijing understood as opportunity. We are going to go inside the relationship between Tehran and Beijing that produced this morning's announcement. We are going to examine what American sanctions actually created when they were applied year after year against Iran. We are going to look at the economic architecture that China quietly constructed across the Gulf while American policy was focused on military deterrence. And we are going to answer the question that shipping executives, energy ministers, and defense planners in every capital on earth are asking right now: who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz? And what does the answer mean for everything that flows through it? Stay with this, because the leverage that built this moment was assembled in plain sight, and Washington chose not to see it. 10 years ago, Iran was isolated. The sanctions architecture that the United States and its European partners had constructed around the Iranian economy was genuinely painful. Oil exports had been cut to a fraction of their peak levels. Banking access was severed. Foreign investment had retreated. The Iranian currency had lost enormous value. Western economists and Western policymakers looked at those numbers and concluded that the pressure was working, that eventually the economic pain would produce the political capitulation that the sanctions were designed to achieve. That conclusion felt logical. It was wrong, not because the sanctions were not painful, they were. It was wrong because of what happened in the space that American economic pressure created. China walked in, not loudly, not with grand declarations or strategic announcements. China walked in the way water fills a space, quietly, completely, finding every available opening and occupying it. Chinese state oil companies began purchasing Iranian crude at prices that reflected the sanctions discount, paying less per barrel than the open market would have demanded, but paying reliably, consistently, and in volumes that kept the Iranian economy functioning. Chinese construction firms moved into infrastructure projects that Western companies had abandoned. Chinese telecommunications equipment replaced Western systems that sanctions compliance requirements had made unavailable. Chinese manufactured goods filled the retail and industrial supply chains that Western sanctions had emptied. And in 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership agreement that committed China to $280 billion in Iranian energy and infrastructure investment in exchange for a guaranteed, discounted, long-term supply of Iranian oil. The document was public. It was reported. Western analysts described it as largely symbolic, an agreement whose implementation would be complicated by the same sanctions environment that had driven Iran toward China in the first place. Those analysts were measuring the wrong thing. They were measuring the financial mechanics. They were not measuring the strategic intention. The intention was not just economic, it was architectural. China was not buying Iranian oil. China was buying Iranian strategic alignment. And Iran was not just selling oil. Iran was acquiring a partner whose economic weight, whose permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, and whose tolerance for American displeasure was sufficient to give Tehran the one thing that sanctions had been designed to deny it: room to operate. At 6:48 this morning, 40 minutes after the joint Iranian-Chinese announcement began circulating through global news systems, the oil futures market in London opened to a price movement that traders described in real time as disorderly. Brent crude moved $11 per barrel in the first 6 minutes of trading, not because supply had been interrupted, not because a single tanker had been stopped or a single pipeline had been cut, because the market understood, in the way that markets often understand strategic shifts faster than governments do, that the governance framework for 21% of the world's daily oil supply had just changed hands. Insurance underwriters for Gulf shipping began issuing emergency risk reassessments within the hour. Two major European shipping firms suspended Hormuz transit bookings pending legal analysis of the new registration requirement. While oil markets were repricing the new Hormuz reality, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson was holding a press conference in Beijing with a composure that reflected careful preparation rather than improvised response. Every question from foreign journalists about whether China had coordinated with Iran in advance of the announcement was met with the same answer. China supports cooperative maritime governance frameworks that respect international law and the sovereign rights of coastal states. The spokesperson said it 7 times. She said it the same way each time because it had been prepared and rehearsed for exactly this press conference, which China had known was coming because China had helped schedule it. While that press conference was projecting Beijing's calm to the world, Washington was running a very different kind of meeting. According to two sources with knowledge of internal communications at the State Department, in the hours following the announcement, the initial assessment call between senior American diplomatic and military officials produced a level of institutional confusion that one participant later described to a colleague as the foreign policy equivalent of discovering that the foundation of your house has been replaced while you were focused on repainting the walls. The specific source of confusion was not the announcement itself. It was the compliance list. Because when American officials pulled the registry of vessels that had already submitted to the new Iranian-Chinese transit framework before the public announcement was even made. The list was not short. It included vessels from 14 countries. It included shipping companies operating under flags from nations that Washington considers partners. It included cargo routes that supply military logistics chains in the Indo-Pacific theater. China had been quietly building compliance for months. The framework was announced publicly this morning. It had been operational in practice long before the press release went out. A second meeting, this one between the National Security Advisor and the ambassadors of three Gulf state partners, took place at 9:30 in the morning Washington time. Sources describe an atmosphere that was markedly different from previous conversations on Gulf security. The ambassadors were polite, they were engaged, they asked careful questions about American intentions and American capabilities. What they did not do, according to a person familiar with the meeting's substance, was express the automatic alignment with the American position that similar conversations had produced in previous years. One ambassador, speaking carefully, asked a question that the National Security Advisor was not prepared for. He asked whether the United States had a framework for engaging with the new Hormuz governance structure, or whether Washington's position was purely one of rejection. The National Security Advisor did not have an answer ready. That absence of an answer was itself the answer the ambassador needed. Why did China build this leverage at this specific moment? Follow the energy mathematics, because the numbers tell the strategic story more clearly than any diplomatic statement. China imports approximately 11 million barrels of oil per day. Roughly 55% of that supply transits the Strait of Hormuz at some point in its journey. For China, Hormuz is not an abstract strategic interest. It is a physical requirement of economic function. Every factory, every power plant, every logistics system in the Chinese economy that runs on petroleum-derived energy is downstream of whatever happens in that 21-mile wide channel between Iran and Oman. For decades, China's energy security at Hormuz depended on the same American naval guarantee that every other importing nation relied upon. American warships kept the strait open. American military presence deterred Iranian closure threats. China benefited from American security provision without paying any of the political costs that American allies in the region were expected to bear. China's strategic leadership looked at that arrangement and identified it as a vulnerability. A nation whose most critical energy supply line is secured by a rival power is a nation whose economy can be held hostage by that rival's strategic decisions. The comprehensive partnership with Iran, the investment in Iranian infrastructure, the oil purchase agreements, the technology transfers, the diplomatic cover at the Security Council, all of it was directed at a single strategic objective: replace American security provision at Hormuz with a governance framework that China shapes and that American leverage cannot reach. This morning's announcement is the completion of that project. The United States spent a decade trying to pressure Iran into submission through economic isolation. China spent the same decade using Iran's economic isolation as the entry point for the deepest strategic partnership in the Gulf's modern history. Washington was playing checkers with sanctions. Beijing was playing a different game entirely. The power shift this creates extends far beyond the Persian Gulf. American global influence has rested on two foundations for 80 years: military reach and economic centrality. The carrier groups provide the military reach. The dollar's role in global energy pricing provides the economic centrality. What the Hormuz governance framework does, with the China Ocean Shipping Company as its operational partner and Chinese yuan denominated transit fee settlements as its payment architecture, is introduce an alternative economic infrastructure into the world's most critical energy corridor that operates outside the dollar system. This is not accidental. This is the strategic intention that the 25-year partnership was always pointed toward. Here is the domino sequence that is now in motion. If Gulf shipping companies accept the new Hormuz transit framework to avoid operational disruption, they legitimize the Iranian Chinese governance claim. If they legitimize that claim, other coastal states in strategically important waterways begin calculating whether similar frameworks are available to them. If those calculations produce similar arrangements in other critical choke points, the American underwritten freedom of navigation architecture that has governed global shipping since the Second World War begins to fragment at its edges. And if it fragments at its edges, the economic and strategic assumptions that every American alliance in the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East was built upon begin to shift in ways that no American military deployment can reverse. While Washington is absorbing the immediate announcement, Tokyo is running an energy security emergency assessment. Japan imports nearly 90% of its oil, and a significant portion of that supply transits Hormuz. If Japanese shipping companies operating through the strait are required to comply with an Iranian-Chinese governance framework, the political implications for a Japanese government that has maintained strict alignment with American Hormuz policy create a domestic political problem with no comfortable solution. While Tokyo is running that assessment, Seoul is running the same one. While Seoul is running it, the energy ministries of every major European importing nation are running versions of it simultaneously. The Gulf states are in the most acute position of any regional actor. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, their oil exports transit the same strait that Iran has just claimed governance authority over. Formally, their position is opposition to Iranian encroachment on freedom of navigation. Practically, their position is far more complicated, because opposing the framework loudly means choosing a confrontation with both Iran and China simultaneously, and the economic relationships each of these governments has built with Beijing over the past decade make that confrontation enormously costly in ways that have nothing to do with the Persian Gulf. The American response toolkit has been exposed this morning as dramatically more limited than previous administrations had been willing to acknowledge. Sanctions against Iran have already been maxed out across years of progressive application. The marginal effect of additional sanctions on a country that has already been excluded from Western financial systems, that has already built its economic survival around non-dollar trade with China, is close to zero. Military escalation in Hormuz risks the exact energy market disruption that the governance framework is designed to make Washington hesitate about triggering. Diplomatic pressure requires partners whose own economic calculations are now producing a very different risk assessment than American policymakers need them to produce. The leverage that the United States lacks at Hormuz this morning was not taken away suddenly. It was never built. While China was investing $280 billion in a 25-year partnership with the country that sits at the mouth of the world's most important energy corridor, Washington was investing in sanctions packages that drove Tehran deeper into Beijing's embrace with every successive round. Every sanction that cut Iran off from another Western market was a sanction that created another opening for Chinese penetration. Every isolation measure that reduced Iranian economic options was a measure that increased Iranian strategic dependence on the one partner willing to absorb the diplomatic cost of that relationship. China built the leverage by showing up. America lost it by staying away. So, where does this leave the world tonight? Iran holds a governance claim over Hormuz that is backed by the economic weight of the world's largest manufacturing nation, the world's largest shipping company, and the world's largest bilateral energy partnership. The United States holds a military presence in the Gulf that is formidable and real, but that has no mechanism to reverse a legal and economic framework that does not require military defeat to impose its effects. The Gulf states are beginning the most significant strategic reassessment of their relationship with Washington since the oil embargo of 1973. And the global shipping industry, which operates on razor thin margins and cannot afford weeks of legal uncertainty about transit requirements, is making practical compliance decisions that will create facts on the ground faster than any diplomatic process can respond. The Strait of Hormuz has a new governance framework. It was built over 10 years of patient Chinese investment and Iranian strategic patience. It was announced in a joint press release that used polite bureaucratic language and cited international shipping law. It will not be undone by a press conference or a carrier deployment or another round of sanctions on an economy that is already adapted to maximum Western economic pressure. Iran set the rules this morning. China supplied the leverage that made those rules stick, and the United States is writing statements about international norms to a world that is already reading the compliance forms. What is your honest assessment? Is there a strategic path available to Washington that can actually reverse what was announced this morning, or has the window for American leverage at Hormuz closed in ways that no administration, regardless of its willingness to act, has the tools to reopen? Put your analysis in the comments. Subscribe. The first formal response from a major Gulf state government to the Hormuz framework announcement will tell us everything about how fast the regional realignment is moving. The moment that response lands, we break it down in full. Do not miss it. The rules have changed. Make sure you understand the new ones.